everyone, and welcome to Groove Builders, the show where we create together. I'm your host, Disorderly Cone, and in this episode, we're going to be building St.Peters Basilica from Genesis Technologies. Now, this build comes to us from our friends over at Crazy Toys, and if you haven't checked out their website yet, you definitely should. They got all kinds of really cool models on there, some of them kind of hard to find, with great prices and fast shipping. Now, if you're looking to pick up St. Peters after today's episode, look no further than the description down below with a direct link to their website. Now, Groove Builders, this build has been known to give builders out there a really hard time with all of its add-on detail and, of course, attaching the main parts to the base. Will we have those same problems? Let's find out together on the workbench. Groove Builders, welcome to the workbench. We have our St. Peters Basilica here in some Genesis Technology packaging. And looking at the front, we see a 5 out of 5 star rating, which means this might be one of our most difficult builds so far here on the channel. Let's go ahead and open up our package. We have our instructions, and we have our metal. And look at how big that stand is, and all that detail. If this is just one sheet, I can only imagine what the other two look like. Let's go ahead and open up our metal. Groovers, all 3 sheets, and look at all these parts we have to form. But all that detail is just so nice. Alright Groovers, let's get building. With our tools and metal in hand, we begin to cut out our first couple of pieces for St. Peters Basilica. And Groove Builders, just touching this metal, I can feel all the little bits of detail, which means this metal might be a little bit more difficult to shape than what we're used to. Great question, R2. The main reason why metal that has a lot of detail in it can be a little bit tricky to work with is because it's actually a little bit thinner. That's right, all of that little laser etching detail actually takes away a lot of the metal, making the metal sometimes a little bit easier to bend in places where it shouldn't. So you have to be very careful to make sure that when you're forming all of your pieces that the bends are going exactly where you want them. Sometimes this means you're going to have to bend and shape parts a little bit slower than you're going to want to. But trust me, take your time with this. Nothing is worse than trying to get a kink out of a part, especially when there's a lot of detail in it. And actually thinking about it, our dome here is a perfect example of a step where you might run into some kinking problems trying to get the proper shape. I recommend using something around your home to help you shape it if you don't have a doming set like mine. But more on tools a little bit later. Let's go ahead and talk about forming this dome with just using your tweezers. I'm going to use our main dome as an example. You'll notice here that we have 10 petals to form. What I recommend doing is picking one petal, doesn't matter where, and slowly start to bend that petal, bringing your tweezers down incrementally as you go. I recommend going no more than 2 millimeters from your original bend at a time. Following this method should greatly reduce your chances of accidentally kinking the metal, although accidents can happen. Once you've got your petal about where you think it's going to be okay, it's time to start bending your second petal. Now what I recommend doing here is kind of doing the same thing that we did the first time, except this time we're going to follow the seam of the first petal that we've already bent. Now this is very important. You don't want to leave any gaps as you're bending that second petal, because if you do, it will be very noticeable in the end product. Once your second petal is all lined up, it's time to repeat this process for the remaining petals. At the very end, when everything is nice and shaped, I recommend double checking your dome to make sure everything is the way you like it, because on the next step, we're going to be securing these petals together. I know R2, I typically don't talk about specific parts of a build, but in this case, I mean, the hardest part of this build is really the domes in my opinion, so if you don't know how to do them, I think it might be really helpful. You're right, R2. The instructions would also be helpful. Let's go ahead and take a look at those together. Starting at the top, we have a QR code which we can scan to get a 360 view of our model while we're building. This comes in handy when adding different parts of detail onto our model, and we need to make sure that it goes in the proper orientation. Like those top 6 spires, those are very easy to put in the wrong direction if you're not careful, and double checking this 360 picture can really help with that. Next, and just to the right, we have a drawing of St. Peters Basilica. Then just below that and to the left, we get a good look at one of our parts. Here is where we get a good look at what our insertion tabs, our insertion holes, and our fold lines look like. When it comes to any 3D metal model puzzle, it's very important that we take our parts and form them to the instruction specifications. This means using the fold lines on the part sometimes and bending some things 90 degrees while other things barely at all. Regardless, make sure you follow the instructions very closely when it comes to forming all of your pieces. Eventually, you'll be taking your formed piece here and attaching it to another part using the tabs and insertion holes. Now you might be wondering how we secure our parts together. Well, that's taken care of just to the right here with our circles and triangles. These two symbols are scattered throughout all of our instructions, and they tell us how to connect all of our pieces together. Every single time we see one of these blue circles, you want to take as much of the tab as possible in your tweezers and then bend it down 90 degrees, normally as flush as you possibly can to one of the parts. Now, when we encounter our triangle, we do things a little bit differently. We want to grab as much of the tab in your tweezers as possible and then twist it 90 degrees. I always recommend following the instructions when you're going through your model the first time. And then when everything is complete at the very end, go over it again to see if you can maybe change some of the tabs to make it look a little bit better. Now, just below our circles and triangles in that small little box there, we have two recommended tools for this build. The first one being needle nose pliers and the second one metal scissors. Both of these tools are great for different things. Like the metal scissors are great for cutting our parts out of our metal sheets, while our needle nose pliers are great for forming some of our longer pieces. That being said, there are some other tools I would definitely recommend for this build. Starting with a really strong set of tweezers. These are great for forming all of your smaller parts, and when you use them in conjunction with your needle nose pliers, it can really help you form some of the smaller pieces you need to do with this build. Another tool I would keep my eye out for is a doming set. Now, this is not necessary for metal model building, but they do make things a lot easier when it comes to forming some of our cylinders and of course our domes. Now, groovers, you can always use things around your homes to substitute a doming set. Like for instance, a drill bit set. There's all different kinds of sizes of drill bits that are great for forming our cylinders. For domes, I would recommend using different size marbles. It can be a little tricky sometimes to find the right size, but once you do, you'll be very pleased with your end result. Now finally, just below our recommended tools section, we have 3 schematic drawings of our metal. Now these are very useful for helping us find our parts when the instructions tell us we need them. Just look for the corresponding number, and then what I do after I take that part out is just black it out. I find that by doing this method, it makes it a lot easier for us to be able to find our parts later on down the road. And with that, Groove Builders, we've finished up with our instructions, and our build here is almost done too. We just need to attach a few more pieces and form our edges of our base. I think it's funny sometimes to think about how we can build this massive heart of the Catholic religion in just a matter of hours, while the real thing was over 2,000 years in the making. That's right, Groove Builders, 2,000 years. I hear builders out there complaining about projects going over 2 hours. Imagine this one. But if you ask me, it was totally worth it, because St. Peters Basilica is a true marvel of human architecture. We did it, Groove Builders! We built St. Peters Basilica, and look at this thing. It's just absolutely beautiful. With all of its laser etching and coarse parts, this build looks fantastic when complete. But there are a few things you're going to want to know if you're building it at home. Let's talk about those things in construction. My first point when it comes to building St. Peters Basilica is that some of these pieces can be a little bit tricky to form with just one tool. My recommendation is to use both your tweezers and maybe some needle nose pliers in conjunction together to help you get some of these smaller details properly shaped, especially along the roof here and along the back. You'll save yourself a lot of time and heartache. My second point is definitely related to my first one. There's a lot of really nice laser etching all over St. Peters Basilica, and it makes it look really nice. But that also adds a little bit of difficulty when it comes to shaping some of our parts, and if we're not careful, we'll think we're folding a part along the fold line, but in actuality, we're folding it where the detail is, and that's only because there's so much detail on all of these parts that kind of makes them a little bit weak. So I recommend double checking all of your pieces to make sure you're folding them on the fold lines. You'll thank yourself in the end. For my third and final point, I want to talk about all of these parts going on to the base. Groove builders, this is definitely the most frustrating part of the entire build, and I found myself getting very frustrated with actually this church right here in particular. My recommendation to do your best at this is really just to work with one tab at a time, securing them as you go. You might find yourself stretching some of the tabs to reach their spot, and that's because the church may have not been formed exactly correctly. Now, groove builders, another way to get your tabs in easily is to pre-bend all of your tabs before putting the church onto your stand. This will make your life a lot easier. Now, when it comes to the courtyard, pretty much the same thing is to be said. You really just want to secure one tab at a time as you go, and eventually everything will click in. And with that being said, groove builders, let's move on to build time. St.Peters Basilica from Genesis Technologies took me just over 10 hours to build, and I feel like that's going to be about average for most people out there that have the proper tools at their hands. Now, groove builders, the majority of my time was spent on the back here forming all of these columns, and while they didn't take too much time, they definitely got frustrating after a little bit of a while. So group builders, my suggestion is to take plenty of breaks with this build. You definitely don't want to get frustrated or rush this one because the end product is just so nice. And finally, groove builders, my thoughts. St.Peters Basilica from Genesis Technologies is a fantastic build for anybody out there who's looking to upgrade their architectural collection. There are a few things on here that you need to know about, like attaching things onto the base can be a little bit difficult, and these little archways here also can be a little bit difficult to get the pieces into. But besides that, groove builders, this build is extremely straightforward, and I'm not exactly sure as to why they gave this a 5-star rating. Like I said, sure, there's some domes and there's cones here and all this little laser etching detail that goes along the sides and the pillars, but again, I really don't understand why they gave this 5 stars. If you're on the fence of picking one of these up, I would say go ahead and do it. You'll be very impressed with what you have in the end, and if you're new to metal model building, just remember to take your time. I think you'll be very addicted after something like this. And with that being said, group builders, we're at the end of our show. I had a really good time building St.Peters Basilica with you, and if you guys had a good time, don't forget to press that like button. For more videos like this, hit subscribe as well, as we got all kinds of really cool content coming out in the future. Until next time, group builders, keep building. Now, I gotta find a place where I can put this massive structure. Maybe I should hang it next to Stitch. What do you think?